Okay, so imagine a world without taxes.
Without taxes.
No DMV, no government telling you what you can or can't do, for better or worse.
Sounds kind of nice, actually.
Utopia. Recipe for disaster.
Yeah.
That's the question you had for us, right?
Yeah.
You wanted to deep dive into anarcho-capitalism, and to do that, we're cracking open A Spontaneous Order, The Capitalist Case for a Stateless Society by Chase Rachels.
Big title.
It's a mouthful, for sure.
But an interesting topic for sure.
What's fascinating about this book is that Rachels isn't just daydreaming about a world without rules. He's meticulously arguing that a society without a government, specifically an anarcho-capitalist one, isn't just possible, it's actually preferable.
Really? I mean, how does he even...
And to be honest, when I first picked this up, I was skeptical.
Yeah, no government.
I mean, no government, how would anything get done?
Right, like who builds the roads?
But Rachels dives right into the mechanics, starting with how a free market could handle, well, everything.
Okay, so he's a free market guy.
Big time. He argues that free markets, without government interference, are the most efficient way to allocate resources and meet everyone's needs.
And how's that work?
His argument is that when you're free to pursue your own economic interests, you naturally innovate and compete, which drives down prices and gives everyone more choices.
Okay, so more competition, better for everyone.
Exactly. It's like instead of a government agency deciding how many potatoes to grow, farmers would directly respond to what people are actually buying.
Supply and demand.
Exactly.
But what about monopolies? Wouldn't we just end up with one giant corporation controlling all the potatoes?
It's funny you should mention that because that's one of the biggest misconceptions Rachels tackles head on. He argues that those mega corporations everyone fears are often created by government interference, not prevented by it.
So the government's actually causing the problem.
He points to things like licensing laws, which limit who can even enter a market, or subsidies, which can give certain companies an unfair advantage. A great example of this is the taxi industry in many cities for decades. These tightly regulated systems with limited licenses often led to higher prices and fewer choices for riders. Then along came ride-sharing apps that completely upended the system.
Right.
Rachels would argue that this is a prime example of how competition, not government regulation, can often be the best driver of innovation and better services.
That's kind of mind-blowing. So he's saying that instead of the government protecting us from monopolies, they're sometimes the ones creating the conditions for them to thrive.
That's his argument, yeah.
But if we're ditching the government, what happens to things like contracts and making sure everyone plays fair? That's where courts usually come in, right?
Hold on to your hats, because this is where it gets really interesting. Rachels envisions a system where private agencies would handle those functions, kind of like competing businesses.
Competing businesses for law.
He argues they would be incentivized to be fair and efficient, because people would only choose to use agencies with a good reputation.
So instead of a single court system, you'd have a marketplace of justice providers.
Sounds like something out of a science fiction novel. And that naturally leads to the question, would it actually work? That's the million-dollar question. Would this system actually be fair and just, or would it just favor whoever could afford the best justice?
That's a big concern for sure.
Yeah, because like, what if the rich people just get away with everything?
Right. But Rachels argues that reputation and accountability would be paramount. In his model, if a justice provider developed a reputation for bias or corruption, people simply wouldn't use their services. It's kind of like online reviews, but with much higher stakes.
So you're picturing leaving a Yelp review after your last dispute resolution.
Exactly.
2 thumbs up for swift arbitration, but the snack selection could use some work.
It sounds wild, I know.
Yeah, but I mean, people take those reviews seriously.
They do think about how much we rely on online reviews for everything from restaurants to doctors. It's not that far-fetched, but this brings us to another big question. The philosophy behind all this, if there's no government, what's stopping people from just doing whatever they want, even if it harms others? Right, it can't just be a free-for-all.
Exactly. So here's where Rachels dives into the core tenets of anarcho-capitalism, starting with the idea of self-ownership.
Self-ownership.
It's the belief that you own your own body and your own labor, and no one, not even the government, has the right to control them without your consent.
Okay, so that makes sense. I mean, it's my body.
Exactly.
But how does that work in a society?
Well, it ties directly into the non-aggression principle, or NMP, which essentially says it's never okay to initiate force or coercion against another person or their property.
Okay, so I can't steal your phone.
You got it. And you
Yeah.
can't force me to bake you a cake, even if I'm the best baker in town.
Even if you're the best baker in town. So under this thing, we're all just supposed to play nice and respect each other's stuff?
In theory, yes.
Okay, but what about, like, theft, violence, fraud, without police or a traditional justice system? Wouldn't it just be a free-for-all?
That's the natural concern. And it's where those private security and arbitration agencies come back into play. Rachels argues that even without a traditional police force, these agencies would be responsible for protecting their clients and resolving disputes.
So it's almost like a subscription service for security and justice.
Kind of, you choose a provider that aligns with your needs and values.
Okay, but how would they actually enforce the rules? Would they have their own police forces, or would it be more like a system of mediation and voluntary compliance?
That's where it gets really interesting. Rachel's envisions a system where these agencies would have agreements with each other to recognize and enforce rulings. It's like a web of interconnected agreements, much like international law today, where different countries cooperate even without a single world government.
So these private agencies would have to play nice with each other.
Exactly. Imagine a dispute between two individuals who subscribe to different agencies. Those agencies would need to have a system for working together to resolve the issue fairly.
Okay, that makes sense on paper, but it also feels a bit idealistic. What happens if someone refuses to cooperate with these agencies, or if they can't afford their services? Would this system just end up benefiting the wealthy while leaving everyone else vulnerable?
Those are some really important questions, and they highlight the core of the debate surrounding anarcho-capitalism. Critics argue that it could easily lead to inequality and instability, with the wealthy essentially able to create their own rules.
So a system built for the rich.
That's the concern. But Rachel's would likely counter that these private agencies driven by market forces would be incentivized to provide fair and affordable services to everyone because ultimately their success depends on attracting and retaining clients, regardless of their income level.
So it all comes back to competition and the power of the free market to regulate itself.
Exact.
It's a bold claim, for sure, but beyond the practicalities of running a stateless society, let's talk about the moral implications. Rachels argues that a stateless society is actually more ethical than one with a government. How does he justify that?
He starts with a bold claim. Any system based on coercion, like our current system of taxation and government control, is inherently immoral. He argues that we have a fundamental right to autonomy and self-determination, and the government infringes on those rights whenever it forces us to do things against our will, even if it's for the supposed greater good.
So he's basically saying that taxation is theft.
Essentially, yes. He argues that individuals should be free to decide how to use their own resources without the government taking a cut.
That's a tough one to swallow for a lot of people.
It is. It's a view often criticized for potentially undermining social safety nets and public services that rely on taxation.
Right, because then what happens to schools and roads and helping the poor?
That's a common criticism, and it raises questions about how a stateless society would address issues like poverty, healthcare, and education. Would these be left entirely to private charity and voluntary cooperation? That's exactly the model Rachel's envisions, and he argues that it wouldn't necessarily lead to chaos and neglect. He believes that free from government programs, individuals would be more likely to support causes they believe in and to develop innovative solutions to social problems.
So people would just step up and help each other out of the goodness of their hearts.
That's the idea.
It's an interesting thought experiment for sure.
Absolutely. And I think it's crucial to acknowledge that Rachel's isn't arguing for a utopia where everyone's always happy and conflict doesn't exist. He acknowledges there would still be disagreements, even in a stateless society. His central point is that a system based on voluntary cooperation and individual rights would ultimately be a more ethical and just way to live.
It's a lot to wrap your head around, and I'm sure some listeners might be thinking, okay, this is all very theoretical. But what about the real world? Is a completely stateless society actually achievable, or is it just an interesting thought experiment?
That's the question, isn't it? And, to be honest, it's a debate with no easy answers. But perhaps a more productive question is this. If free markets and voluntary cooperation are as effective as Rachel's and other anarcho-capitalists believe, why do governments exist in the first place?
Ooh, that's a good one. It seems counterintuitive if we could, in theory, function without them.
It's a question philosophers have been wrestling with for centuries.
Centuries.
There are many theories, of course. Some argue that governments are necessary to protect us from external threats, while others believe they arose to provide public goods that wouldn't be profitable for individuals to provide, like roads or national defense.
It's fascinating to consider, and this deep dive into a spontaneous order, even if you don't agree with all of it, forces us to think critically about the systems we often take for granted.
It's exactly. By exploring these radical ideas, even if we ultimately disagree with them, we gain a broader understanding of the world and open ourselves up to new possibilities now before we get too lost in hypotheticals. Let's bring it back to the book. We've talked about the economic and philosophical arguments, but there's another key aspect we need to address: Rachel's perspective on property
Oh,
rights.
yeah, he's very passionate about that. How
Yeah.
does it all connect back to anarcho-capitalism?
Well, for Rachel's, property rights are an extension of self-ownership.
Yeah.
He argues that if you own your own body and your labor, you also own the fruits of that labor, the things you create or acquire through voluntary exchange. It's a fundamental building block for him.
So if you build a house with your own two hands, it's 100% yours, and no one, not even the government, has the right to take it from you.
Ex-
That's a pretty strong stance.
It is, he believes, secure property rights are essential for individual freedom and economic prosperity. It's all about incentivizing people to work, invest, and create, knowing they'll reap the rewards of their efforts. If you're not secure in your ownership of something, why bother putting in the effort to build or create it?
That makes sense, but what happens when property rights come into conflict, for example? What if someone's land has a resource that another person desperately needs? How would that kind of dispute be resolved in a stateless society without resorting to a government court system?
That's where Rachel's faith in free markets comes in. Again, he believes those conflicts will be resolved through negotiation and voluntary agreements. His argument hinges on the idea that people are generally rational and will act in their own self-interest. This means he believes they'd be more likely to find a solution that benefits everyone involved rather than resorting to force or coercion.
So instead of lawyers in courtrooms, we've got
Clear.
neighbors sitting down over a cup of coffee, hammering out an agreement that gives one access to the resource while fairly compensating the other. It does make you wonder if we sometimes default to relying on government intervention when a little old-fashioned problem solving might do the trick. But here's where Rachel's takes this idea of property rights even further, applying it to things like intellectual property and even digital assets.
Okay, so we're talking patents, copyrights, algorithms, cryptocurrency.
He's basically taking these age-old principles and launching them into the digital age.
So in his view, if you create a piece of music or write a program, it's entirely yours, and you have complete control over how it's used and distributed.
Exactly. He sees strong individual ownership as crucial in the digital world. Of course, this raises a whole new set of complex questions about defining and protecting intellectual property online. It's a lot murkier than, say, someone building a fence around their physical property.
Right, because how do you draw those boundaries in the digital world? It really makes you think about the challenges of applying these principles in a constantly evolving digital landscape. And this brings us back to the heart of a spontaneous order. Even if you don't buy into the idea of a completely stateless society, Rachel's presents a compelling case for questioning the role of government and exploring alternative ways of organizing ourselves.
He definitely pushes you to look at things from a fresh perspective. It's easy to accept the systems we're born into, but taking the time to examine them to consider different models can be incredibly eye-opening. So for our listener who requested this deep dive, what's the key takeaway you hope they walk away with from exploring a spontaneous order?
If there's one thing I hope they remember, it's is never underestimate the power of individual liberty and voluntary cooperation. We can still strive to empower individuals, reduce government overreach, and foster a society where people are free to pursue their own goals and interact with each other in mutually beneficial ways.
It's a powerful thought. It's about finding that balance between individual freedom and the need for some form of social structure and cooperation.
Exactly. And who knows, maybe somewhere within these seemingly radical ideas lies a seed of a solution to some of the challenges we face today.
It's definitely a conversation starter and a reminder that the best way to approach complex issues is with an open mind and a willingness to challenge our own assumptions.
Well said. And on that note, we're going to wrap up this deep dive. But keep those mental gears turning, because the exploration of these ideas doesn't end here. There's always more to learn, more to question, and more to discover.